Hey internets, so today I'd like to take yet another look at Second Thought's content, because unfortunately he is still spreading quite a lot of disinformation out there, and it's laced with some pretty bad rhetoric, that a whole lot of people are unfortunately falling for. Because in case you didn't already know, Second Thought is not actually a channel that tries to be objective in any way. He's a pretty far authoritarian lefty, aka tanky, aka communist. But to his credit, he isn't exactly trying to hide this. Just some pretty basic digging will show you that he has a regular podcast with other Marxist-Leninists, so the fact that he is a commie isn't exactly a groundbreaking revelation. But because the algorithm tends to randomly show people opinions coming from channels that tend to lean left, a lot more than otherwise, some people might not know this. So in case you're someone who had the algorithm casually recommend some of his videos to you, and just sort of watch them without knowing this, well, now you know. Now the issue here, and what I'll be going over in this video, is that a lot of communist media content tends to be pretty subversive and deceptive. And this isn't too surprising, since communism is an ideology that likes to advertise itself as a supposed answer or solution to all the world's corruption that they allege has occurred at the hands of capitalism. And thus, if the capitalist menace is defeated, then the communist utopia can be ushered in. That's pretty much where all their rhetoric goes. And the problem, of course, is that all evidence and reason goes against this claim of theirs. They aren't actually able to substantiate the solution that they are offering. So what communists tend to do instead is pretty straightforward. Well, they just sort of outright lie to you. They either say things that are just flat out untrue, or they use intentional logical fallacies to subvert and or just deflect from the truth. And as for Second Thought's basic method, what he basically does is he just makes videos about a wide variety of topics, and then just sort of slips in some communist rhetoric, or otherwise blames the free market for whatever problem he is discussing, without actually providing any context, evidence, or rational explanations to back up his claims that capitalism is at fault. And this dishonesty can be found in just about every video Second Thought has put out. So to show you what I mean by this, I'll be focusing on and refuting some of the things in his more recent content in the last few months as of April 2024. Now, the first video I'd like to focus on is this one on media dishonesty, currently titled How the Media Controls the Masses, where he pretty much is just going over media dishonesty in regards to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. But the main problem of it can be found in this clip.
Here's a quick rundown. You have a tremendously wealthy group of people and business interests. They donate large sums of money to politicians. Politicians deregulate the media. Now these ultra-wealthy players have both elected officials and media outlets in their pocket. What do they do with that influence? They spend a little bit of money, relatively speaking.
Did you catch the deception there? The key lie in what he just said is that he claimed that they lobby for deregulating the news media. This is 100% not true. What they actually lobby for is increased regulation, along with some very generous subsidies. And to some degree, you can tell that he's lying because he doesn't exactly specify what he's talking about when he says deregulations. Deregulating what exactly? What regulations are being removed here? Any specific examples he'd like to give us? Nope, we don't get any of those. Because of course it's not actually true. So I'll give you some examples of how they regulate and what subsidies they push for. The most obvious one being increased patents and intellectual property rights. For example, Disney lobbying to extend to the Copyright Act of 1976, with the purpose of extending their copyright protection of their work to the author's lifetime plus 50 years. Or 75 years for any kind of corporate-owned work. In other words, they tried to regulate the market and how intellectual property works, specifically in a way so that individuals have a harder time competing with the massive corporations that Second Thought claims to hate so much. And as for patents, each and every one of the big six media companies, as they're sometimes referred to, own thousands of them. Like Comcast, for example, owns 9,022, and they regularly lobby to keep each and every one of them. And as far as subsidizing goes, there's a really good article that I'll be linking in my sources section that goes over how governments are able to control the media by selectively choosing who to fund using subsidizing, with them generally funding the outlets that advance whatever the government's current agenda is. And this happens all throughout the world. The result being that not only does the state fund propaganda, but they're also using your tax dollars to pay for it. Isn't that wonderful? Their main goal is to ultimately to use these regulations in order to make it illegal for anybody else to compete with them. And sometimes they get into a lobbying fight where two big corporations are lobbying to regulate each other, like cable and wireless companies lobbying over who's allowed to use what frequency band. It's not uncommon for these big cable and media companies to sometimes just lobby the government to outright make it illegal to compete with them at all. For instance, Comcast will often create agreements with some local governments in order to create some zoning restrictions that bar any other provider from entering the area that they're building their service in. In other words, through government regulation, they gain an unnatural monopoly over the market. Another big thing that's being left out here is that the state and the corporate media have a very strong revolving door relationship, which means it's not uncommon at all for members of big media to then go work for the government, and then members of the government go work for the media again as soon as the term is up. This creates a sort of state media proxy problem where a lot of mainstream media you see is nothing more than state propaganda outlets. In other words, when you turn the TV, a lot of times you're just seeing content that's been curated by feds. And Second Thought is just kind of leaving this all out because the evidence is pretty strongly against what he's trying to imply. He's trying to imply that we need more government control and regulation to make the media better, which is completely nonsensical. It is a very well-known fact that greater press freedom incentivizes more competition, which exists in greater amounts in countries that follow more free market policies. By contrast, it's the countries that have the least amount of press freedom and the more regulations attached to them. They're the ones that often have no competition, and the only news that exists in those countries is purely state propaganda directly, not even by proxy, such as the North Korean media, which is very well known for propagating a cult of personality around the Kim family, often implying they have the ability to magically control the weather. Now, if you wanted better news, what you would actually want is increased competition so that consumers have more choice, since as it turns out, people don't like being lied to very much. So deregulation and removing the red tape that is put in place to stifle the competition would actually be the cure, not the disease. There has never been a case where increased government regulation and control over the media has led to that media becoming more objective and truthful. That's just not a thing. It's never happened. And what's so sly about this rhetoric from Second Thought is that he just kind of slips it into his video and moves on to other subjects without really giving you any time to think about or question what he just said, which creates a sense of irony in that in his video about media propaganda, he himself is pushing authoritarian government propaganda. There are much better ways to criticize the mainstream media, and I've made my own video on how exactly to do that, which I will link at the end of this video for anybody interested. Anyways, another big instance of authoritarian rhetoric coming from Second Thought can be found in his video on TikTok, which is about why the US government banning TikTok is nothing more than a really big giant grift. And this one is particularly sad and unfortunate because roughly the first 15 minutes of this video from him is actually quite good. And I actually agree with his take that the primary reason for banning TikTok is so that the US government can better control the media that young people are consuming. And he gives fairly decent arguments for this and for why it has nothing to do with national security. This closely mirrors my own personal take on it, which is that the politicians whining about TikTok controlling kids are just mad that they have competition. And yet, then he just had to do it. The problem comes in right here in this clip.
But they won't protect our children in school. They won't codify reproductive rights. They won't do anything about climate change. This is the bottom line when we're talking about capitalist regimes. The dominance of capital is always 100% of the time the thing that gets government action.
Ah, yes, of course. Capitalism is when the government does stuff. He just had to do it. Second Thought was so close to making a relatively good, neutral, objectively true video. And yet he had to just kind of slip in this idea that all of this is the fault of capitalism. Because capitalism is when government regulates away its competitors. Well, anyways, anybody who has read books by Austrian economists already has a pretty good idea why this is just total economic illiteracy right here. So first off, I'm going to give a long answer for why this is wrong. And that is just to recommend that you read A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans Hermann Hoppe. Reading this will give you a pretty solid rational explanation for why the state regulating away competition is actually a form of socialism. But of course, not everybody has time to read all that. But the short explanation is that the main point of capitalism involves pure protection of private property rights. The state is using aggression to steal that property away, or in the case of TikTok, forcing a company to sell something that they don't actually want to sell, then that is a use of violent aggression to force the market's hand. And this goes against the concepts of freedom and private property rights that people who are for free market capitalism are actually in support of. And the basic reasoning error that Second Thought is making here is that he's equating capitalism and power to mean the same thing, which is of course completely absurd because power and hierarchies will always exist in any system. By making this false comparison, Second Thought can then blame anything and everything on capitalism, despite the fact that, yet again, everything he's complaining about in this video is made worse under communist regimes. A modern communist regime would be far more controlling and far more repressive of social media apps. And we know this is true because China is significantly more socialist than the United States. And Chinese regulation of its social media makes banning TikTok look like nothing. China has banned nearly all of the US social media app platforms. So YouTube's banned in China, Google's banned in China, X is banned in China, Instagram's banned in China, Facebook's banned in China, WhatsApp is banned in China. And why are they banned? Well, because the Chinese Communist Party bans criticism of itself for anybody who is not a member of the Communist Party themselves. In other words, Chinese citizens do not have any kind of freedom of speech protections at all. They have no First Amendment rights against the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Chinese Communist Party can't control United States-based apps and are unable to control the narrative on English-based social media if their citizens in China could connect to them and use them. So the CCP just bans them. So this sly implication insert from Second Thought that becoming more socialist would solve this problem is just objectively not true. But anyways, those two videos are really just examples where communist propaganda was just sort of randomly inserted into videos that otherwise could have easily been made without any kind of partisan position in them at all. The real authoritarian grift comes in when the mask comes off. You see, Second Thought makes a lot of videos that have nothing really to do with capitalism and socialism, where he tries to randomly insert some random false statement where he incorrectly allocates blame to capitalism, despite evidence and all reason to the contrary, with examples being the two videos I just went over. A lot of what he has to say about the media, as well as the reasons behind banning TikTok, are again actually correct. And so what happens is a lot of people might not notice the underhanded inserts of authoritarian propaganda. And so then people subscribe to his channel, only to later be recommended videos like this one. Yeah, capitalism is bad, but what can we do? Where he goes into communist theory based around the book What is to be Done by Vladimir Lenin. Like I said, he isn't exactly hiding the fact that he's a communist, and that of course becomes pretty obvious when you see a video like this one. Now, I'm not going to respond to the excerpts from the book from Lenin itself right here, because honestly, that book has been done to death. It's a dead horse. And I personally already explained problems with the theory at large in a lot of other videos on my channel, and I don't really feel the need to reinvent the wheel here. But I would like to explain what's wrong with this clip.
It's all well and good to expose the evils of the boss, but we also need to expose why the boss acts the way he does. His actions are informed by the capitalist system. If we get rid of capitalism, the antagonism between boss and worker goes away.
Yeah, no. Pretty sure last time I checked, in every single historical instance where socialism was attempted, what happened isn't that the supposed agitation between worker and boss magically vanished. What happens instead is that the government becomes your boss. And any agitation you might be complaining about becomes even worse because now the relationship is not only no longer voluntary, but the dispute over scarcity is still there. Scarcity simply being the economic reality that the universe does not magically provide man's desires for goods and services at our will. For instance, if you want an ice cream sundae doesn't magically manifest right in front of you. You have to either make one yourself or buy one from somebody who does know how to make them and has the resources to make them. And if you make one yourself, of course, you have to procure those resources for yourself. Instead, we live in a universe where resources are scarce and have alternative uses. And of course, that means that other people might disagree with you on what those uses are. And capitalism is really just a way to resolve scarcity by using private property rights to resolve those disputes without any kind of violent conflict, or aggression as it's sometimes called. Now, going back to what Second Thought said, the big reasoning error that communists tend to make and tend to push is that they try to push the view that the capitalist system of private property rights is scarcity itself, rather than a method to resolve conflicts over scarcity. This is an example of what you call a false cause fallacy, where a relationship between two things is misunderstood to mean that one is causing the other. In this instance, by implying that the agitation between boss and worker is caused by capitalism, he's selling you the idea that capitalism is causing scarcity, without actually talking too much about scarcity. And that's very common with communists, by the way. If you watch a lot of BreadTube content, or watch socialists, or listen to communists, one thing you'll notice is that it's very, very strangely rare for them to ever use the word scarcity at all. And this is the reason why, because they don't really get it. They don't understand that what they're doing is essentially just kicking the can from employer to state. And the only real difference in this association is that the one with the state is non-voluntary. In other words, you still have the problem of scarcity, you still have disagreements over scarce goods. The only difference you've created here is that you are now a slave to the state, because you don't actually have a voluntary association of whether or not to do this work. The reason for this really just comes down to a basic fact of the universe. You cannot get rid of the concept of power itself. So if you have no moral system in place whatsoever, then things automatically go to might makes right, aka the law of the jungle. And we human beings, fortunately, realize that we need to rise above the laws of the jungle and come up with rules of how do we resolve the conflicts that happen as a result of scarcity without tearing into each other, such as what two tigers might do if they find the same prey at the same time. And to that extent, protection of private property rights has proven itself to be the most effective, not at just resolving the scarcity, but also reducing the scarcity. because capitalism incentivizes people to create goods and services, which then reduces the scarcity of those goods and services. Communism, on the other hand, well, changing the economic system to one that is based around central planning has been proven to not reduce scarcity at all, and forcing people to become more equal by law doesn't get any kind of reduction of scarcity in it either. Hence, again, why communists just completely avoid the topic entirely, and try to imply that capitalism itself is either the cause of scarcity or is scarcity itself. And by making this fallacy, the communist has effectively become a useful idiot for the consolidation and monopolization of power into one single state conglomerate. Or to put things very simply, what he's effectively saying here is that the government is corrupt, therefore we need bigger and more government to fix the government corruption. And that's really unfortunate, because a lot of times there actually is a base truth behind Second Thought's videos. It's true that the media is corrupt and uses sleight of hand tactics to push nonsensical and fallacious propaganda that benefits special interest groups. And it's true that banning TikTok and all the excuses we've been given that it's about national security is nothing more than claptrap. The United States government does not care about the privacy of your data. If they did, then Edward Snowden would have never had to blow the whistle on the NSA. But the solution to these problems is definitely not what Second Thought is selling. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, or tip, or leave a comment for the algorithm or whatever. Till next time.